In the 1994 comedy Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, the titular character discovers that Lieutenant Lois Einhorn had gender confirmation surgery and that she was previously known as Ray Finkel, a disgraced Miami Dolphins kicker. As Ventura previously had some very brief romantic contact with Einhorn, he becomes disgusted with himself that he kissed a trans woman. At the climax of the film, Ventura exposes Einhorn, both her role in the missing Dolphins mascot and her personal history, by stripping away her clothes and pointing out that she had not yet had bottom surgery. This information alone is enough to both disgust and terrify all the hardened police officers. The film does not nail down the terminology well, and though Einhorn is referred to as a man and not a trans woman, the scene is nonetheless transphobic. Such transphobia still exists in popular media today, although most blockbuster films in 2020 would probably not be as overt or center so much of the comedy of the film around mocking a trans woman, partially due to changing values and partially due to fear of a backlash. When critics and audiences say that comedy ages poorly, scenes like these immediately come to mind. The idea being that comedy ages poorly due to the progression of society. However, this is only one way in which comedy movies age so rapidly. It's simply the most obvious. The concept of comedy aging poorly is not new, as it is well understood among comedians and comedy writers that it does, in fact, consistently happen, but not always well understood why. Who better than I to answer this question, someone who has never been funny, not even once, by accident? But what I lack in humor, I make up for in the twin abilities of reliably charting data and coming to reasonable conclusions. My two sexiest qualities. Join me, won't you, as I ruin everything because I had nothing better to do this week. I will limit these observations to movies only as far back as the early 80s, within my own lifetime, or quantum leap rules. In the 1994 comedy Dumb and Dumber, Harry and Lloyd are accidentally responsible for the death of their criminal companion. They feed him peppers, not realizing that he has a condition that would make this fatal. Upon his death, Lloyd looks up at the diner and says, "Check, please!" This is an example of an overused line in a comedy movie. Jokes, quips, and sight gags that were contemporaneously fresh but have since been used and reused too many times since, and date the jokes retroactively. This may have garnered laughs in 1994, but now that "Check Please" has been used so many times in other films since the release of Dumb and Dumber, revisiting this film can't elicit the same response.
Oh, that's great. I wrote a hit play and directed it, so I'm not sweating it either.
Can we get a check, please? Check, please?
In fact, one could argue that by the time Dumb and Dumber made this joke, it was already overused. It was done in So I Married an Axe Murderer a year prior in 1993, Robin Hood Men in Tights in the same year, and many times before this, including twice in the 1987 film Spaceballs. There are a number of other instances of this one joke, and worst of all, there is little variation to it. The same joke, told differently or told with some kind of twist, can mix it up, but "Check Please" happens with such regularity and such consistency that it is amazing that it lasted as long as it did. In 2020, audiences will rarely hear "Check Please" as a comedy line because comedians and writers have wisely moved on. This is not simply a matter of cringe or consequences that this is now a hack line. Laughing is involuntary, and as a formula, it relies on surprise. An overused joke can no longer surprise any of us. The same joke told to someone who has never heard it will elicit a laugh. Well, maybe. Here's a joke. A stranger sees a eunuch walking down the road alongside a woman. The stranger asks the eunuch, "Is she your wife?" And the eunuch tells the stranger that eunuchs don't have wives. So the stranger says, "Oh, so she's your daughter." If you have never heard this joke before, you may have laughed, or at least smiled, but this joke is literally ancient. It's from Love of Laughter, the oldest surviving collection of jokes, dating back to roughly the 4th century. Basically, the actual age of the joke is not relevant to whether or not it's funny. Instead, it's more like how many miles the joke has on it for you personally that determines its wear and tear. Whether or not it has been overused in a culture, and whether or not the surprise is gone. Check Please, the joke itself, was never bad. It's only been used and reused so many times that it has gained a kind of cultural normalcy, a neutrality, something that is not surprising and therefore not funny anymore. The joke on its own and in a vacuum separated from this overuse is pretty funny and follows a basic theory about humor, that being funny often involves the realization of incongruity, a mismatch between a concept and a situation. Check Please works as a joke because of the incongruity of concept and situation. The concept is that saying check please in a restaurant is a neutral ending to the dinner and is precipitated only by the meal being complete and with no other contributing factors. The situation is that there is a contributing factor this time, usually a ludicrous one such as in the case of the restaurant scene in Dumb and Dumber. The neutrality of the statement combined with the ludicrousness of what happened immediately prior is the realization of incongruity, and why it's funny. It's why people laugh, even if they are not charting why, over-examining it, and further ruining it, like I am right now. Humor as surprise is both the reason why the joke initially worked, the surprise of the incongruity, and the reason the joke no longer works in a culture that has heard it before, the lack of surprise due to overuse. The same can be said of, "That's gotta hurt," and a myriad of other overused comedy lines. Check Please is 2 words of dialogue and can therefore age quickly, but sometimes entire concepts and situations are repeated enough to age quickly. An example of a comedy concept and situation combination that aged quickly is the novelty of hip-hop being performed by someone who is not expected to be a hip-hop artist or enthusiast. Robin Hood Men in Tights featured a hip-hop group that breaks from their incredibly basic rhymes to sing something more at home at a Renaissance festival. The Wedding Singer from 1998 had an elderly white woman performing Rapper's Delight. Both Austin Powers' The Spy Who Shagged Me and Austin Powers' Goldmember featured Dr. Evil performing hip-hop. Not only is this concept and situation combination overused by today's standards, it could be argued that it was old by Goldmember, released in 2002. The novelty of hip-hop had worn off and the music genre had simply become mainstream years prior. The entirety of this joke is that the audience was not expecting the character to be interested in the genre of music. No other genre was used to this effect so frequently in 90s comedies. Speaking of Austin Powers, the trilogy of films is painful to watch in 2020, but part of the reason why is not actually its own fault. It suffers from a kind of inverse of the overuse problem. Instead of utilizing overused jokes within the movie, Austin Powers is uncomfortable to watch due to the overuse of jokes specific to Austin Powers outside of the movie, either through mocking parody or sincere appreciation. Most notable, this comes in the form of Powers' many catchphrases.
Oh, behave. Yeah. Yeah, baby!
Powers' catchphrases briefly became part of the language for a few years during the craze, much in the way that dough from The Simpsons is now said even without thinking of that particular reference or the origins of the word. Dough can be used casually. Unlike dough, the Austin Powers catchphrases were too specific to the trilogy to have the same lasting power and cannot be said as casually. By the time the third movie premiered, the jokes and catchphrases being repeated outside the movie trilogy became stale, resulting in the final movie not having the same impact. Also, it's just kinda bad. As a culture, we overused the catchphrases rather than too many movies overusing them. There were only 3 after all. Similarly, this happened to Borat, a very successful comedy from 2006 that has retroactively been ruined due to both parody and sincere admiration. The only comedy gained from saying a Borat catchphrase so many years after its debut is comedy about how unfunny and stale the catchphrases have become.
My wife made it. My wife! Borat!
It's not the fault of the film that it was so popular and so quotable. Nevertheless, Borat is now hard to watch for reasons that exist primarily outside the film. Reference humor operates under the same formula as most other comedy, the incongruity here being a reference to something familiar in an unfamiliar context.
You must be the Monopoly guy. Thanks for the free parking.
One problem with reference humor is when the incongruity is paper thin, such as characters from Scary Movie simply repeating the "What's Up" Budweiser commercial verbatim. There is almost no incongruity if the parody is nigh indistinguishable from the original. Another problem with references is how poorly it ages. A commercial, for example, is usually not something revisited for future generations the way classic movies always stay in the popular consciousness, or how television shows get rebooted for new audiences. Commercials just don't have that kind of staying power. Scary Movie is intended for young adult audiences in the year 2000, but young adults in the year 2020 will either not understand the reference, or if they do, will probably cringe about a gag that their parents already found stale. So, are all comedy movies doomed to age poorly? Not necessarily. There are ways to future-proof a comedy, at least to some extent. Trends in comedy change, and those are impossible to predict, but there are some steps that can be taken. For one, referencing whatever is popular in the same year as the release of the comedy should be avoided. For another, if a joke in movie B has been used before in movie A, using it in movie B will help propagate it to some unrelated movie C, causing movie B to age poorly and not even hold the distinction of being the first. And finally, in terms of humor that mocks a marginalized group that was socially unprotected during the time of the comedy's release, maybe just don't mock a marginalized group even if society has not yet caught up. Historically, this realignment in values and eventual protection of the marginalized group is inevitable. People sometimes say, you know, the only minority we can mock these days is... and then they fill in some blank. And then they proceed to do that, not realizing that this is temporary. Maybe just try being ahead of the curve instead of desperately trying to mock marginalized people while you still can get away with it. Just a thought. All movie genres age due to advancements in special effects, changing styles of acting, and such, but for all the reasons mentioned here, comedy may have the most hurdles. But it can be better, it can work. It just requires a little added care.
Check, please. With my winning smile, I'm a living lesson in flair and style. You just can't help but stare at my savoir-faire. I'm Nouveau, Deco, Roman, Greco, Rococo, Baroque, Bebop, hip-hop, flip-flop. Somebody stop me!